welcome to the second episode of In Session, Bennington to Montpelier, Cat TV's new show, connecting even more so than we already are, the community of Bennington with our legislators. My name is Jack Rossiter-Munley. I am the host of this roundtable formatted show, and I am coming to you from the downtown Bennington Multicultural Community Center. And I am so happy to be joined by Representative Mike Nigro, who is the very first return guest to In Session. So welcome back, Representative Nigro.
Thank you. Happy to be here.
I'm very happy to have you here. We may be joined by another legislator in a little bit. We'll see. But if nothing else, we are very happy to have you with us because there is a lot to follow up on from our first conversation and also from what has been a very busy week in the legislative session from the last time we sat down to talk. So you gave a fuller introduction of yourself in our first episode, and I encourage folks to go back and watch that. And any legislator who's on for the first time will give a fuller introduction like that, where they talk in some detail about their personal background and what led them to the work that they do. But if you could just quickly refresh people just on the district that you serve and the committee that you serve on in the legislature.
Sure thing. So I am District 5. I share that district with Mary Morrissey, Representative Mary Morrissey, and I sit on the Appropriations Committee, and this is my second term altogether, but on the Appropriations Committee, which is focused on the state budget.
You talked quite a bit in a general way about the work of the Appropriations Committee on our first episode, but I'd love to dig into a little bit more granular detail on the process that your committee is going through with the state budget, because it is a particularly it's always a complex process to put together a $9 billion state budget, but there are some particular pressures that are coming up this year. There's some interesting conversations around how to make that budget come together. So I wonder if you could give us a little bit more detail on the process of that committee and the pressures facing the state budget this year.
Sure. It's interesting, and I'm learning a lot about this. Is my first year on appropriations. So my first term in the legislature, of course, I voted on budgets. I paid attention to budgets. But now on appropriations, I'm learning on a much deeper level, and you really start to understand some of the challenges that Vermont faces trying to fund the things we want to fund, trying to do the work of a state that we think is important. So the last time I was here, I talked about one of the big challenges we're facing is uncertainty at the federal level. So we get a ballpark of $2.5 billion from the federal government every year out of a $9 billion or close to $9 billion budget. So a really significant amount of federal money that there is a lot of uncertainty about now. Some programs have already had funds frozen. There have been certain, you may have seen in the news, in the local news in the banner, that there were funds going to the Ninja Path in North Bennington. That looks like they are not going to come through because of changes at the federal government level. So that one is not only potentially very damaging or very difficult for our budget, but it's also at the moment a complete uncertainty. There's a few things we might know about. So they've already said what the thought is about the funds for that path. But some of the big dollar amounts, so the biggest amount of money we get on a federal level is Medicaid matching dollars that helps for all of our Medicaid programs. And we don't know. The House in Congress just passed a budget resolution that certainly it doesn't cut Medicaid, but it makes it draws a lot of concern to the fact that might be the only way they can meet some of the reductions in spending that they're trying to meet. So we're trying to make a budget, but we don't really. It's kind of like if you're writing checks to pay your bills, but you don't really know how much is in your checking account. Maybe you have $1,000 in there, but maybe you have less than that and you didn't realize it. So that's the situation we're in. We're trying to budget, but we don't know some of the changes that are going to come down on the federal level. The other thing that I think is interesting that folks might not be aware of if they're not paying really close attention to the state budget is there are a lot of different ways that the state raises funds. Okay, so we get, close to a third or, a little less than a third of our funds from the federal government. So there's a big bucket of money that comes to the state. Obviously, after that, we get a lot of income taxes. So businesses and private individuals are paying income tax. That's, of course, one of the main sources of income for the state. But then there's a lot of other smaller, we have sales tax that, funds part of the state budget. We have DMV fees. We have property transfer taxes. So there are all sorts of fees and taxes that funnel into funding the state. Now, nobody likes paying taxes. I don't like paying taxes. Nobody does. But at the end of the day, many of us like some of the things we do with those taxes. So even though I don't like paying taxes, I'm the first to complain when I'm driving down a road in Vermont and there's potholes all over. So it's important to me that we put money into paving and to caring for our bridges. I think a lot of people fall into this category. They want to pay the least taxes they can, but they also recognize there are services we need from the state. If we're going to live in a good environment, we want certain things to be paid for. So a lot of the ways we set up these funding sources to give the state dollars to work with come through these unique pathways. So I'll give you a couple examples, but also a couple of examples of why this is a budget problem and something that we need to deal with in the state. But, one example is we have a fund, a special fund called the Tobacco Settlement Fund. And it was from lawsuits that states put together against the tobacco industry, I think in the 90s or early 2000s. Basically, after it came out that the tobacco industries knew how bad smoking was and didn't release that information to the public. So there were lawsuits, and the tobacco companies agreed to this. They said, we were at fault, and they give a certain amount of money to our tobacco settlement fund every year, and it's based on a complicated equation, but mostly it's based on how many cigarettes folks buy annually. And we use these funds from the Tobacco Settlement Fund for a number of things. We use them for tobacco prevention programs. That's important. But maybe even more important than that, we use them to match Medicaid dollars, because part of the recognition in that fund was that smoking has become a big cost for states because smokers have very expensive medical costs and have many health problems. And that was the tobacco industry's fault. So we use some of these dollars to help fund paying for some of those medical treatments, medical problems, and Medicaid dollars that are going to tobacco related issues. So that's a big deal. That's a big amount of money. I think loosely it goes up and down, but on an annual basis, we're talking about $20 million a year that we spend in Vermont. We're not a big state. $20 million is a meaningful amount of money. What problem do we have? The problem we have is maybe nationally a good one. People are smoking less, which means we have less money coming into that tobacco settlement fund every year. But we still have a lot of folks that smoked for much of their life or when they were younger that are still facing these medical problems. So the medical problems aren't going away. The cost isn't going away. The Medicaid dollars we still need, but the Tobacco Settlement Fund is getting smaller and smaller every year. Well, we've been able to make it work so far, but right now the projection is that next year we're going to have a deficit, which means something potentially will have to be cut someplace. And, I think this is one of the key messages of the budget that sometimes we forget to talk about or we aren't clear about. But basically, any dollar you spend one place means you can't spend it someplace else. You can't put a dollar over here without cutting a dollar over here. We end our year with a balanced budget in Vermont every year. It's not law. Some states, it's actually law, they have a balanced budget, but it is what we do. And we all agree on that. The governor, the legislature, I haven't spoken to anybody that would accept anything but a balanced budget. So, there's an example of, one of these financial funds that has been working for us for a long time, but becomes a problem because of the way it's funded. I'll just say one other, which is, and this is an important one, and Tim Corcoran, our representative from my neighboring district, he can talk about this even better than myself because he's been on the transportation, he's the vice chair of the transportation committee. But, transportation dollars are very important. We pave roads, fix bridges, repair culverts. These are things, again, that most Vermonters use on a daily basis. And the fact that we fund a lot of that through gasoline tax. But the problem with that is we've been using less gasoline every year. Now, some of that's because of electric cars, but the real reason, the biggest reason for that is simply that cars are more fuel efficient than they were 15 and 20 years ago. And gas prices are not as high as they, I know we don't like them to be lower, but truthfully, they're not that high compared to other years. So right now, our taxes on gasoline have diminished a lot. And right now we have a significant problem for how we will pay for our road projects in the coming years. And again, I think that's a core function of government, is to take care of infrastructure. I think it's one of the areas that all the political parties agree on, is that infrastructure is really, really important. So again, these are just the ways that every funding source can have its own potential problem to it.
I think a really interesting aspect of this, and I'd be curious for your insights on it, is that the two examples you gave with the tobacco settlement fund, with the gas tax, those are examples of those funds going down being representative of other fundamental broader goods. So we are being more conscientious about the use of fossil fuels and their impact on the environment. Fewer people are smoking, but it creates these additional pressures on a state budget where the system for funding the state has been built on taxing existing industries that are transforming. So what are some of the transformations that are being considered for new revenue for the state as these broader transformations take place in things like use of fossil fuels or the number of people who are using tobacco products?
Sure. That one starts to stray a little bit into some political issues because, and again, I say that I try to take in a show like this a balanced approach and be able to talk about both sides of it. I'm not here to press necessarily my beliefs, but the governor has been very clear that for years now that he's not going to support any increase in taxes and fees. I respect where he's coming from the standpoint that living in Vermont is not inexpensive. We are a pretty expensive state in a lot of ways. Taxes are pretty high in Vermont, and a lot of Vermonters feel this. I mean, I think a lot of Vermonters, who really runs Vermont? Well, it's the Vermonters who vote folks in, and the voters of Vermont right now have a lot of concerns about costs. Last year it was property tax. That was the biggest concern. But in general, I think folks feel like Vermont can be expensive. Now, there's some reasons for that. We have some unique challenges. Being a rural state simply makes a lot of things more expensive. It's more expensive to run the smaller schools we have in Vermont. It's more expensive to repair lots of road with less people traveling on them, paying the taxes to fix those roads. So being a rural state's a challenge, but at the same time, that's where the governor stands, is we have to manage costs. And I understand that perspective. Certainly, I think on the Transportation Committee, and I'm not talking for Representative Corcoran right now, but I think for that committee in general, there's been some appetite to be able to raise some fees, possibly DMV fees, or possibly find ways to increase the amount that electric car drivers, pay into the system. to help pay their share essentially, because, in a sense, they're not paying that much of their share if they're not paying gasoline tax. And there's a lot of other, we're talking about old ones that are on the decline. On the other side, there are some newer things that are growing. So we legalized cannabis, the cannabis market a few years ago. I have partially mixed views about that, but either way, we have a legal cannabis market, and we have healthy tax revenues coming in from that, and they've been growing. We legalized online wagering a couple of years, or a year ago, really. And that's also a growing revenue stream. Now, I think, similar to your argument that smoking and burning fossil fuels are not great things, probably cannabis and sports wagering they're also things we don't want to encourage the public to do. We would actually probably like to see the population do less of that, or at least manage it responsibly. But there are new areas to raise revenues that come along as well. But this is a challenge, and again, at the end of the day, the numbers on the two sides, what we bring in has to match what we pay out. So it becomes a balancing act.
You mentioned the specific challenges of being a rural state, and I'd be curious for your perspective, particularly from the sort of appropriations committee budgeting side, what are some of the opportunities that are unique to Vermont from this perspective? Where do we have real chances for growth, not just in revenue, but in general, as we're thinking about the direction that a rural state takes? Where are there opportunities for us right now from your perspective on appropriations?
Yeah, it is easier to talk about the challenges than the opportunities. But I'm bullish on Vermont. I'm bullish on Bennington, and I have been for a long time. I've been saying that since I've moved here. Um, I think so. Before I get to what I see as an opportunity, I'm going to lead in with the challenge. But I promise I'll get to the positive. I'll get to the opportunity. So we talk about all of these challenges in the state. We talk about, our transportation fund. We don't have the money to pave the roads. And we talk about our property taxes increasing, and that we need to reform our education system. And we talk about a healthcare system really in crisis right now. Our insurance prices have been really out of control. I can say personally, my increase from last year to this year for what I'm paying for my insurance is dramatic. And so all of these issues, I think largely, can go back to a central issue around growth versus stagnation in Vermont. And, this is a tough conversation from the standpoint. A lot of people say, oh, you want to grow Vermont. You want Vermont to be New Jersey. And no, I don't. I don't. But we've been essentially doing two things: shrinking in population and getting older as a population. So it's not even just population. It's also the fact the folks that live in Vermont are older. More of us are retirement age or retired, less working population, less workforce, and less kids. Our school enrollment is way down, and that is one of the big problems. So the problem is we talk about things like we need to fix the education system, and we got to talk about healthcare because that's easier to talk about than how do we get Vermont to grow. The truth is, none of these other issues will go away completely or become easy, or will we completely overcome if we shrink as a state. There is no math equation for how our schools will thrive with steadily declining enrollments. So this is this isn't a surprise. A lot of folks in the state talk about this. The governor's talked about this. The legislature has tried things. We were one of the first in the country to try paying relocation costs for folks that want to move to Vermont. That was contentious. A lot of people didn't think it was a good idea. But again, I think it was just thinking outside the box with this realization that all of these systems we have that are struggling need either stabilized demographics or growth. And this is where I think Vermont has some advantage, is that I don't think we've fully capitalized on it yet, but we have a wonderful quality of life in many ways in Vermont. Each year there's a couple organizations that put out like happiness and quality of life indexes that Vermonters frequently are at the very top. We're right up, us in Hawaii or like some of the places where folks are happiest to live. And over time, I think we have an opportunity there. I think we live in a relatively climate safe area. So, Florida has been ravaged by terrible hurricanes and, Midwest tornadoes, wildfire on the West Coast, really dramatic. Now, I don't want to discount, we've had some flooding in the last few years. So I think everybody feels some impacts, everywhere. But again, compared to like the wildfires and compared to some of the other climate and weather related issues across the country, we have a relatively safe, state. And I think between that and our quality of life, we have a sales pitch. I think there are people that want to or will want to live in Vermont. But it's just getting the right mix of things to be able to make that happen. A lot of folks have said we can't try to attract people to Vermont because we don't have the housing right now. That's kind of true, but then you get into a chicken and the egg sort of situation. You get the people here first, so we have the builders, we have the jobs, we have everything we need to grow, or do you build first? I think the answer is you have to do it all. But growing our population and growing particularly our working age and family population is a really hard one. There is no instant quick fix to this. There's no bill I think we could just write, and if we just pass this, we would start growing. But I think it's important, and I think it has to be part of every conversation we have. The governor does talk a lot about regulations that make it harder to develop in Vermont. And I take a balanced approach to that. As I say, nobody wants Vermont's character to change, but we need to be a place that's worth investing in. And I agree with the governor on that point.
On the topic of attracting families, or just families in Vermont in general, I feel like it would be a major oversight if we didn't at least talk a little bit about the education bill. So I know you also explained last show the intense focus that appropriations work takes up, but I know you're also closely following the developments around the education bill. So in the past week, the 176-page education bill from the governor finally came out to all the legislators, and I'm interested for some of your takes on that, and not only your own takes, but also what some of the conversation within the legislature and in Montpelier has been now that there is a bill that is before everyone.
Sure. It's unusual for the legislature to take on such broad system changes. I think several years ago, we changed a little bit of our funding formula, and that had a big impact in education, how the formula for how we fund individual schools. Or how we weight students. It's complicated. I don't want to get in the weeds on that, but that had a big impact on different schools. But compared to what we were looking at right now, that was a tiny little change versus now we are really looking system-wide at dramatic change. Um, I don't think that we're wrong to be doing that, but it's, I guess some of my takeaways right now is we are worried about time. The legislature typically is in session until May. Uh, we're talking about a very limited number of weeks on an annual basis. We're talking about 19 weeks to try to completely overhaul the system. I think the general ideas of the governor's plan, there's a decent amount of agreement on many of them. One of the features is a reduction in the number of school districts and supervisory unions. And, I think most people agree that we have way, way too many, and that we can have some efficiencies and some cost savings by reducing the number. The governor's recommendation was 5 districts in the state. I don't know that there's agreement on that. So I think maybe that could end up someplace in the middle. And I don't even know, I'll be honest, I don't even know that the governor or the secretary of education believe that's the number that it has to be. I think they had to have a starting point, and that seems to be it. I think the idea of how we fund individual schools is a shift to something they call a foundation formula. And I don't know that it would be worth explaining here, but maybe that could almost be a whole conversation on a show. But I guess I would say that mostly I think legislators feel like that change is not a bad one. But I think that there are certainly some folks. I've spoken to folks in the Ways and Means Committee in the House, and Ways and Means, they're in charge of the taxes. They set tax rates, they do tax calculations, and they're involved in this because the Education Committee is focused on how we use state education funds. The Ways and Means Committee is focused on how we use property taxes to get those funds. So Ways and Means, I've heard from a few folks that go, this foundation formula is the way to go, but we're not convinced we could do this by May and get it right, and that if we might need more time if that's what it takes to make sure we get it right. So I think there's agreement on that. Again, maybe not the timing. There's agreement on the idea, but maybe not the timing. I think maybe the stickiest area of the whole discussion might be around school choice. The governor has some proposals actually for a school choice lottery that a certain number of families would be able to choose a different school for their children to go to. Voucher systems for schools are a complex issue. I don't want to beat around the bush. I'll say that I don't think vouchers are a good idea for school systems. And the basic problem is, if you have a school that is, kind of middle of the road, and, a bunch of students take a voucher and go to a different school, now that takes funding away from the school. And now the school that starts to decline. So you end up in a voucher system with some very good schools and some very underfunded schools. And that's not what we want. We want balance. So I don't like the idea of a voucher program. Yet I will say, I remember campaigning and knocking on a door and talking to a mother and I told her, I said, boy, I'm really not in favor of vouchers, and I'll tell you why. And she says, listen, I understand that, but my son's going to this school right this minute and it's not doing well. I don't care about, she's like, I'm worried about my son. And I get that. That makes an awful lot of sense. I think school choice voucher is going to, I don't think vouchers are on the table, but I do think school choice and questions around it are going to be one of the most difficult areas to come to agreement. It's also one of the areas where communities disagree. I mean, there's communities that really value their independent schools, and how we manage that's going to be tricky. So I guess those are my quick reads on school today, on where we're at in this process. But I would also say we're really not that far along. We've had language from the governor for 1 week now, so we are not that far along in this process. The Speaker of the House is trying to get the thoughts of our communities. So we have a survey. I'm going to post it on my Facebook page. I'm going to put it on Front Porch Forum, and I'm going to bring a sheet with a link to it to town meeting on Monday night at the Bennington firehouse. And so any folks that want to contribute or want to share their thoughts on this process, we would love that. We really want to. This is a big change, and we want to know what people think.
I think that local connection, that community feedback is going to be really interesting because these kinds of very broad changes do mean very different things in the local context. I'm curious if you quickly have some thoughts. Again, as you mentioned, this is very new. It's a big plan and it's unclear exactly what form of it may happen. But as proposed, what would some of the changes, what would their effects in the Bennington area be like for folks who are here?
Well, again, I want to be careful because I think the issue around independent schools is an important question. I guess I'll talk to the broader things that I know would probably be an impact. I think we'd be seeing our supervisory union become part of a much larger school district. So, the governor's current proposal is essentially that all of Bennington County would be one district. So I certainly, see us growing as a district or as a supervisory union. I think in terms of funding, we probably would be a little less affected than other communities. Even though our property taxes went up plenty and people were upset about it, the truth is, compared to a lot of the state, we were on the low end of property tax increase. So, I think from the funding end, things might have less impact in Bennington than it would in some areas. I think some of the wealthier communities may pay a little bit more of a share that is going to help pay education across the state. But again, I don't know that Bennington will be the most impacted, other than at that district and supervisory union level. Actually, this might go back one question, but I also just wanted to mention one thing because I think it's worth noting that we've saved. We just did a budget adjustment for 2025, and we had about $135 million extra left over. And the Appropriations Committee has saved that for the 26 budget year, with the intention that we're going to use a large chunk of money to buy down property taxes, which in some ways is kind of a short-term answer to property tax. It doesn't mean that schools cost less to fund, and it doesn't mean that we're raising more education funds. It just means we're taking money that we could spend other places. We're just going to pump it into the education system so that we don't have as high taxes. Now, in previous years, there's been folks against that idea, saying, listen, that's a short-term fix. But I will say one good thing about it. The one good thing about it is the income tax is a much more progressive tax, which means if you're low or lower income, you might pay little or no income tax. Whereas if you're higher income, you're going to pay more income tax. Whereas property taxes are not progressive. So oftentimes by percentage of income, if you're a middle income homeowner, you probably pay a much higher percentage of your income to your property taxes than a wealthy homeowner. So in a sense, taking income taxes and buying down our property tax actually makes it a little bit of a more progressive tax year. And it's something that I think hasn't been discussed a lot, but I think it is a more fair way of not putting the burden of our schools on only middle and lower income property owners.
That's a really good point and a really good connection as well between how these two tax systems work and why the pain of the property tax changes is felt more acutely. Um, you mentioned that you're going to be at town meeting with the papers that have the link for the survey. Let's talk a little bit about town meeting. It's coming up. It will happen between now and the next time this show goes out. Here in Bennington, there are 6 proposed changes to the town charter that citizens are going to be voting on. And part of the process for those changes to become real will be them going to the legislature. So just I'll give them in quick kind of layman's terms. They are all resident voting, 16 and 17-year-olds voting, increased power for town liens, a 1% tax on non-owner occupied short-term rentals, the shift of the review powers from the select board to the community policing advisory review board for certain parts of reviewing incidents with the police department, and then a section about the removal of the town manager, or a process for the removal of the town manager. I'm curious for your thoughts on, and a little bit of an explanation of what the next stage of the process will be, so people are getting educated about what those changes are and going out to vote on them as the citizenry here in Bennington. Whichever of those changes get voted through by citizens here, what then happens at the legislative level and what might be the fate of those changes?
Sure. So any of these changes that pass at town meeting day, obviously the ones that don't pass are not going anyplace, but the ones that pass would go to the Government Operations Committee in the House, and that committee would review these changes, and take into consideration things like, are they constitutional? Do they, is there any reason that any of these would be inconsistent with changes we've approved in other parts of the state? They would look at each of these and decide if they would give them a stamp of approval. If so, if a majority of that committee approves them, they would then go to the body as a whole, and we would all vote on them. Then, like a bill, if we pass it as a body, it would go to the Senate. And if the Senate passes it, it goes to the governor to be signed. Now, I will be honest. I think some of these are fairly straightforward in the fact that I think the governor would veto these. I think probably the majority of them are issues the governor has vetoed in the past. He has some, I think he has some reasons that he opposes, again, like non-resident voting and 16, 17-year-old voters.
All voting.
I'm sorry.
All resident voting.
All resident voting. What did I say?
Non-resident.
Okay. Oh, yeah. That's you can't be here on vacation and vote. Thank you, Jack. So non-resident voting and 16, 17-year-old voting. He has some reasons that he has vetoed those in the past. That makes sense to me. Whether you agree with him or not, I think the governor has said, boy, he would like to see consistency across the state, that if we're going to do something, we do it as a state. Otherwise, he says, it's pretty complicated. We have elections that overlap. We have school districts that aren't the same district as a house or state district. So we have all these and the town district for meeting day. So any voter could vote in a various number of districts throughout the year. And it makes sense to have that less confusing. That's the governor's rationale. I have voted in favor charter changes that the governor vetoed in the past. But I actually understood his rationale, didn't think it was crazy. So I guess my fast answer is I would expect these to be vetoed, and I would not expect the legislature to be able to override them.
That makes a lot of sense. And it will be interesting to see how that process plays out and then what any next steps might be on a statewide level for some of these ideas and what other communities are thinking, because that's where some of the energy and some of the questions around these changes came from, is looking at other communities that had successfully made some of these changes to their town charters, and people in the area, and also the work of the Charter Review Committee on the town level, doing that research and bringing them forward. If they are vetoed, perhaps there will be state level interest, since there is no longer that legislative override with the supermajority in place. Sort of in the spirit of that, last session we talked a little bit about, last episode we talked a little bit about the sort of the general feeling of this session, and I'm wondering how any of that, just a general vibe check on how things are going. Both you and Representative Corcoran had mentioned that you were and are hoping for collaboration and cross-party work and really getting folks who are focused on the issues at hand. And there's concern about how that may or may not hold up over time, especially as issues like the proposed education bill come up, where there are really contentious aspects of them. So I guess I'm curious just for a vibe check on how things are going after another week of work.
Sure. Listen, the reality is there are always going to be significant policy disagreements, and significant disagreements over philosophy and very core philosophy on how to govern. And so, those disagreements lead to a certain amount of pressure in the building, and it's present. But I still think, compared to the past 4 years, certainly compared to the period of time I've been more active and have experience, I still do feel like we're in a better place. That there's disagreements, but that there's still an effort across the board to say, how are we going to work together? So, I guess it's hard for me to say anything other than I'm hopeful. And when we do have a bad day, I'm not giving up on that that thought about how we can work together. It's a focus for me.
That's really good to hear. So we have talked a little bit about town meeting day, and I do like to end this for all the legislators, whether you've been on the show before or not, just quickly mentioning to folks again, just the best way to be in touch with you. And obviously with town meeting day coming up, people will probably have a chance to see you in person. So what is the best way to get in touch? Where will people be able to see you soon? And aside from bringing the information about how to get involved around input for the proposed school changes, what else is on your mind going into town meeting day as our little closing bit for today?
Certainly be at town meeting. Happy to chat with anybody there. I think I want to share my message about some of the challenges facing our budget this year, because I want to be honest. I don't want anybody to be surprised when the new program they were really hoping was going to get through, or the new support for this or some other local thing doesn't come through. I just think I want people to understand where we're at realistically as a state with the budget. So that is certainly top of mind for me, and I'm on appropriations, so that's where I spend almost all of my time every day. So it's pretty hard for me to focus other places. And folks are certainly welcome to reach out to me anytime. My email, you can search my legislative email, but I also have an email. It's Nigro, Nigro .vt@gmail.com. And you can certainly reach out to me there. And I'm happy to answer any questions. And I'm certainly happy just to listen to any of your feedback.
That's fantastic. And the town meeting will be taking place on the the third floor of the firehouse here in Bennington for the Bennington Town Meeting. And I think we're all looking forward to a good one. Excellent. Well, thank you so much for joining. And this has been another episode of In Session Bennington to Montpelier. We'll be back next week.